Okay, we're rolling. So yeah, hold on. Let's give just.
You have to see which of those are you syncing to.
That's right. Yeah, okay, we're going. Sure. Hi, I'm Bob Duke.
I'm Art Markman.
And behind the camera is Rebecca McEnroy, who actually runs all of this thing. There she is. and this is Two Guys on Your Head, which is very strange because, as some of you probably know, this is a radio show, and Art and I have been told often that we have great faces for radio, but this is unusual for us to make a video. But Ruth Buskirk asked if we would participate in what she used to call, I wish she'd still call it this, the Colloquy-Posium for faculty. And we're going to talk a little bit about observing teaching. And I'm sure after we're done, the conversation led by Diane Schallert will correct any mistakes that Art and I will inevitably make.
Yeah, it's very hard to be on camera. I don't know what to do with my hands.
I know, it's very strange.
Yeah.
Okay, so this meeting is titled, How Do We Know Good Teaching When We See It? So one of the things that Art and I thought we would talk about a little bit is what's involved in observing teaching and what kind of things that we might look for when we see excellent teaching.
Yeah, and of course, we need to get beyond the normal way that we evaluate teaching, which is by asking our students how we're doing,
yeah.
Which is a wonderful way to get, from a customer service standpoint, probably a wonderful way to get information, but there's a lot of reasons why students are not the best judges of the education that they're getting.
Right, and of course that's one of the reasons that I think peer evaluation has become such an important part of faculty evaluation. But of course one of the challenges of that is that many people who go into a classroom position themselves in a way that they're looking at the teacher as the students are looking at the teacher, and not really looking at what the students are doing. Now, of course, we can see people with their laptops open. We can see what's on their screens. But one of the things that Art and I have talked about a lot is positioning yourself when you're watching teaching in a way that you can actually see the students' faces and see what the students are doing when the class is going on.
Yeah, it's important to make sure that the students are actually actively engaged in the class. I mean, a lot of times if you sit where the students are sitting, you end up watching the performance that the instructor's putting on. And of course, it's wonderful to know that the instructor is really fluent with what they're saying, that they have a great command over the material. But ultimately, we assume that the instructor has a pretty decent command of the material. And ultimately, what we want to know is whether the students are likely to have a good command over the material. And what we know from all the research on the way that learning happens, students getting that command over the material really requires that they engage with that they do things actively, that they actually explain things to themselves. And it's very hard to know whether that's happening if you're just watching the instructor.
Right. And you know, one of the things that you've talked about a lot, Art, is the idea that learning is hard and effortful. And when we watch a lot of instances where students are sitting and listening to a lecture, there's not a lot of effort being put forward at that time, and with the expectation that you'll listen to the lecture, you'll get some stuff, and then later on the effort will happen. Yeah. And I think one of the things that's been more and more prominent in discussions about teaching is trying to make things happen in class that engage the students in a way where they actually have to generate something from their own thinking that reveals to them gaps in their understanding or misconstruals of what they're reading or what they're hearing the professor talk about.
Yeah, I mean, one way to think about this is that the purpose of teaching is ultimately to influence the memory of the students.
Exactly.
And there's two types of memory. There's declarative memory, which is part of the explicit memory system, which is the stuff you can talk about. Mm-hmm. And then there's also going to be procedural memory, which are procedures that you carry out. Ultimately, as a teacher, you often want to be able to influence both of those. You want students to be able to parrot back a certain number of things, or at least understand material in a particular way. But you also may have a set of skills that you want them to develop. And so it's really important at the front end for the instructor to be very clear about what kind of memory they're trying to influence in their students, and then to design the lessons around those kinds of memory changes. And then for the evaluator, the person who's trying to figure out whether that teaching is effective, to know which types of memory were trying to be affected in order to be able to figure out whether the instructor was actually successful at achieving that goal.
Right. And, you know, there is a lot of talk, as everyone in the room, I'm sure, knows, about so-called flipping classes. And I think what's not discussed enough is what's the reason for all of that.
Because the students on the ceiling.
Yeah, exactly. Put everything's upside down. Is that really what flipping is really trying to accomplish, I think, is having students participating more in recalling things from their memory and practicing skills in the classroom. This doesn't require an entire flipped class. This can happen at any moment in a lecture, at any moment in any kind of activity where the students are asked, and I'll use this phrase again, to generate something on their own. Because I think most of us have a threshold for understanding or perceiving our understanding that's way too low. I mean, if I listen to you give a very, very lucid talk, it's understandable.
Not me.
Well, someone, hypothetical you, give a very lucid talk. It'd be understandable. I think, well, boy, I really understand that because what I could do is follow your explanations. But really, I don't understand it yet. I've just watched you understand it.
Right. And then you believe you understand it, so you suffer from what we call the illusion of explanatory depth, which where you believe you understand this thing fully until that moment when you're actually called upon to explain it for yourself. No, I think that's absolutely right. And you keep talking about, you know, the importance of generating information. I mean, there is a lot of work in psychology on what's called the generation effect, which says that you're gonna be much better at remembering things when you generate the information yourself than when you don't. And that's just one of the principles of explicit memory.
Right.
The more that you generate things for yourselves, the more deeply that you process the information, the more that you think about it and elaborate on it, the more that you are going to be able to actually explicitly recall things later.
Right.
And so that's part of why this is so important. And as you point out, you can flip the classroom on the fly. It doesn't have to be a structural thing. At any moment, you can ask the students to engage with something. And you have to be willing to accept a certain amount of awkwardness with that. I mean, I find in the first week of class, and this is probably politically incorrect, but it creates what I call instant autism in classrooms, where you say to everybody, okay, what did you think of this? And suddenly everyone in the classroom looks down and goes like this. You know, because they don't want to be called on, right? Because they're afraid of making a mistake in front of the class. And a part of what a good instructor needs to do is to make it clear that the classroom is actually a safe space to get the explanation wrong.
Right. And, you know, one of the things that I think it can be a really useful opportunity during a class period is when students are asked to recall information or to practice implementing ideas. That gives them opportunities to see where there are gaps in their understanding or where they may have misconstrued something about an explanation, where there are no negative consequences. I mean, what happens, unfortunately, is if students are reading thinking they understand and listening thinking they understand, the first time they get to test their understanding is in a graded situation where making mistakes costs you points and lowers your grade. And one of the things that we're trying to encourage, and I think most institutions are trying to do this now, is having opportunities for students to get feedback, both from themselves, from their classmates, and from the teacher, about the depth of their understanding when mistakes are not costly in relation to their grade.
That's right. And so I think it's really important that we evaluate instructors not just by how fluently that they are able to present the information, but how many opportunities they give to the students to really mess up the explanations. Right. Yeah. And I think that there's a tendency for many people when they're evaluating an instructor, if the students don't seem to understand the material up front, to think, well, the instructor must have done a bad job of explaining it the first time if the students don't get it, rather than saying, okay, look, these errors that the students are making, that's actually fundamentally part of the learning process, and uncovering those along the way and debugging those mistakes is a big part of what instruction is all about. Right. And that a teacher should actually be given extra points for encouraging the students to make mistakes in that very public way.
Yeah, you know, there's a phrase that I think I made up, so I'll take credit for it, that I think is useful to think about this, and it has to do with creating strategic confusions in students. I think there's a misperception that if you're teaching well, your students are never confused and they always understand what's going on, and you try to obviate their mistake making, when really creating opportunities for students to be a little bit confused and to struggle to resolve those confusions is actually an advantageous way to set up a class.
Yeah, and I think that notion of strategic confusion is related to another concept from psychology that Bob Bjork developed, which is this idea of desirable difficulties. You know, when you look at student evaluations of classes, a lot of times what gives an instructor a high evaluation on a student evaluation is, are they fluent? Was it really easy to understand them? And the problem is, the easier it is to understand the instructor, the less that the student learns. What a good instructor does is to create these desirable difficulties, to find just that level below the frustration point that's going to get people to really work to understand what's happening. And even though that may lower an instructor's student evaluations to some degree, it enhances learning. And so this, strategic confusions are just one of many strategies you can implement to create these kinds of desirable difficulties.
Yeah, and when you think about students having such a tight connection between trying to do things and getting graded, it's understandable that they would be reticent to volunteer to answer, to put something down on a piece of paper that might be wrong. And one of the things that we can do in a classroom to help make this a more constructive experience for students when they're in our presence is have many opportunities for them to do that, so the frequency of it sort of diminishes the magnitude of the emotion associated with it.
Right. And ultimately, I think what we want is for instructors to then get feedback about their teaching that is designed to have them include more opportunities for this kind of learning in the classroom.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Are we wrapping it?
Thanks.
Okay. I think we should probably stop there, and thank you all for listening. And Ruth, thanks for inviting us to be at your party virtually, and best of luck for the rest of the day.
I'm going to keep using the word colloquiposia.
I know, it's fantastic.
Yeah, it's an awesome
That's
word.
not to be wasted.
Yeah.
I'm Bob Duke.
I'm Art Markman.
And this is Two Guys on Your Head.
Live.